Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Aquinas Center's lecture entitled The Politics of Virtue, Love, and Suffering, Abelard, Aquinas, and Womanism in Dialogue with Dr. Michele Watkins. We're so delighted that you have joined us this evening. Tonight's lecture is brought to you in partnership with Candler's Black Church Studies Program and the Aquinas Center's Catholic-Orthodox Initiative. My name is Alice Cameron, and I'm serving as the acting executive director of the Aquinas Center. We are celebrating our 35th year of providing community programming that invites ecumenical conversations while fostering faith and dialogue. In 2017, we began our Catholic-Orthodox initiative from an endowment from Solon and Mariana Patterson. The work of the Catholic-Orthodox initiative includes tonight's lecture series, which occurs annually. But the work also strives to build community between Catholics and Orthodox, focused on our commonality, rooted in our shared history. At this time, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Nicole Phillips. Dr. Nicole Phillips is the Associate Professor of Practice of Sociology of Religion and Culture and Director of Black Church Studies at Candler School of Theology, Emory University. A sociologist of religion and a public intellectual, she teaches courses in community and congregational studies. Her scholarship treats religion, race, gender, and cultural memory studies. She is also developing new research interests in the sociology of science and religion. She is a senior faculty fellow at Emory University's Center for Ethics and associate faculty in Emory's Department of Sociology. Her first monograph, Patriotism, Black and White, landed on the bestsellers list for the Christian Ecumenical and flagship magazine of U.S. mainline Protestants, The Christian Century, in 2019. She has received numerous awards, honors, and recognitions, including being the inaugural recipient of Emory University's 2019 Provost Distinguished Teaching Award for Excellence in Professional and Graduate Education for Candler School of Theology. She received an AB from Wesley College, an MDiv from Harvard University's Divinity School, and an MA and PhD in religion, psychology, and culture with a minor in anthropology of religion from Vanderbilt University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nicole Phillips.
Thank you so much, Alice, for that wonderful introduction. It is my honor now to introduce our speaker for this evening. It is good to see so many of you out tonight, as well as welcoming those who are online with us tonight. The Reverend Dr. Michele E. Watkins is the Assistant Professor of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of San Diego. Dr. Watkins holds a PhD in Theology and Ethics and a Master of Divinity from Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, a Bachelor's of Science in Psychology from Howard University in Washington, D.C., where she graduated Phi Beta Kappa and summa cum laude, and a certification in nonprofit management from Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. She is a native of Chicago and a daughter of the United Methodist Church. Dr. Watkins is a scholar, pastor, activist, shaped by the Black freedom movement tradition. Dr. Watkins is presently working on her first monograph, her first book, tentatively titled Deification for the Desacralized, which places womanist theologians in conversation with Greek patristics and Orthodox theology to construct a meaningful interpretation of the Eastern doctrine of theosis. And so, I'm privileged that Candler's Black Church Studies program and the Aquinas Center have co-partnered to sponsor the 2022 Catholic-Orthodox lecture. It has been delightful to work together with Ms. Alice Cameron, Acting Executive Director of the Aquinas Center, housed at the Candler School of Theology. Because of this year's partnership, it gives me great pleasure to announce the Reverend Dr. Michele Watkins, who will deliver the Aquinas Center's Catholic-Orthodox lecture, The Politics of Virtue, Love and Suffering, Abelard, Aquinas, and Womanism in Dialogue. May we welcome her here to the podium.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips, for a beautiful introduction, and to Alice Cameron for this invite and the Aquinas Center. It's such a pleasure to be here with you. Sound better? So I am working on this manuscript, Deification of the Desacralized, and part of the research trajectory wasn't planned, but we end up in unexpected places and with insightful ideas, and so we welcome them as long as they are helpful. And so one of the ideas that came out of a period of research leave was thinking about claiming the unclaimed persons within the Christian tradition. And Peter Abelard is someone who, he just goes unclaimed by and large. And so I want to thank you for your presence here. I thank you in advance for the beautiful conversation that will transpire afterwards. I am looking forward to creating and curating ideas with you as you listen with me and don't fall asleep prayerfully. The Politics of Virtue, Love, and Suffering. My primary area of research and interest is in theosis, or deification. So it is important to note that this lecture's interrogation of the complicated relationship between virtue, love, and suffering is framed within a historical critical consciousness, particularly of the ways that our spiritual growth and development can be hindered or can be progressively cultivated by our structural realities. Structural realities are ideas that have become lived intelligibilities. I'm a womanist theologian, which means that I privilege material and spiritual experiences of Africana women as a site of divine revelation in my method. So know this, even if it seems like I'm dwelling in the sea of whiteness, that a part of my intention is to always have in the back of my mind the ethics, the cultural heritage, the experiences of the oppressed to help me do my job better and best. I interrogate here the veracity and meaningfulness of Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant understandings of deification as the embodiment of virtue. This is where we find a pan-Catholic or Catholicity domesticated, or a home for all of these different traditions, this understanding of deification as the embodiment of virtue. This evening's lecture, The Politics of Virtue, Love, and Suffering, seeks to propose, 1, the possibility of deviancy as virtuosity, by way of considering the soteriological perspective of medieval French theologian and philosopher Peter Abelard. Abelard's deviancy, or radical departure from the ransom and satisfaction atonement theories in favor of a moral influence theory, is a form of deviancy from tradition. I argue that this state of departing from acceptable medieval theologies of suffering in the spirit of love and justice, despite the consequences that he had to deal with and take up, is an example in itself of moral excellence. There are 3 sections that comprise the lecture. The first identifies some of the shifts in historical and cultural approaches to the study of theology within medieval society, as a way of examining the contextual reality that made it a generative period for someone like Peter Abelard to make a said departure with an overview of his background. The second section considers the distinctiveness of Abelard's theological method, sic non, or rather, doubting in order to inquire, as revealed in his contentious correspondences with representative figures of orthodoxy in the medieval period, such as William of St. Thierry, St. Bernard of Clairvaux, and of course, Anselm of Canterbury, and his loving exchanges with his beloved Eloise de Gentillet. Through presentation of Abelard's theological method, the third section identifies aspects of his method that are fruitful, particularly for womanists and liberationists, in their understanding and speaking about a virtue ethic of love that is oppositional to imposed suffering. And lastly, to demonstrate that this ethic does not happen in a vacuum, but through a dialectical relationship, a back and forth engagement throughout the tradition of the seemingly oppositional propositions of nature and grace, as we find in Aquinas and Dolores Williams. Theological methods are historical. As theologians, it is our method that can orient us toward continuity and or discontinuity within the Christian tradition. Context shaped how Abelard on one end and who we might find like Anselm on the other end, who feel more obligated and even more empowered to promote or question Orthodox theology. The theological method of church fathers such as Ambrose, Augustine, and Pelagius involved mainly scriptural exegesis, engaged for the purpose of exposition, whereas the aim of the scholastics were to utilize reason and truth to make more comprehensible the gospel and the doctrine of the apostles, as well as generate new knowledge and insight to enhance the spiritual life of believers. The patristics were not interested in generating new knowledge. A grand shift from the patristic tradition to the medieval scholastic approach to theology was caused in part by the Carolingian dynasty, the establishment of cathedral schools, the immigration of Eastern scholars from Byzantine and Constantinople empires, which brought the utilization of ancient Roman thought and traditions, and the availability of Latin translations of Greek and Arabic renderings of Aristotle's metaphysics. With new resources and new institutions, theology became more integrative and systematic in its form and function. Scholastic theology involved systematization through the use of debate and argumentation. These tools used to investigate oppositional metaphysical statements and claims, the use of Aristotelian philosophy, the Socratic method of questioning of precepts of the faith, and the joining together of scripture, patristic theology, and philosophy to search and identify the areas of agreement. Medieval theologians were products of these catechetical schools of the Middle Ages, and their scholarly pursuits are reflective of the move into modernity in which Europe experienced a great deal of economic growth, and the church became exceedingly wealthy through its participation in feudalism, colonization, income from tithes, which allowed men of the monastic order to retreat from the manual labor to the study of both theology and philosophy. Each thinker within this particular period represents one of two opposite ends of the spectrum as it relates to monastic theological anthropology, as it informs the doctrine of Christian salvation. Unlike the theological anthropology that affirmed a belief in the doctrine of original sin, which was at the foundation of Anselm's satisfaction atonement, Abelard asserts a more optimistic theological anthropology resembling that of Pelagius of Britain, and consequently rejects the preoccupation with the devil's authority in the patristic ransom theory of atonement. He also rejects this preoccupation with divine egoism that is espoused in the satisfaction atonement theory. Born to a noble family in 1079 CE in the town of Le Pas in northern France, Peter Abelard was the eldest son of both his mother and knight. His father, Berengar, a knight, ensured that his sons were properly educated in the liberal arts prior to their consideration to join the military. Abelard was the student of Roscelin, who was an esteemed philosopher. He had a disparaging reputation by way of his nominalistic doctrine of the Trinity. It was countered by Anselm of Canterbury and the Archbishop of Reims. What I'm pointing out here is that his first teacher is rather controversial. His first teacher espouses a particular method. This questioning is where he learns the elements of dialectics and masters this sí que no, which means yes or no. It's a way of affirming the affirmation and the negation, acknowledging the affirmation and the negation that's present. After what Abelard interpreted to be the envious manipulations of his teacher, Roscelin, he moved to Paris in 1100 and became the intermediate pupil of William of Champeaux, under which he mastered the art of dialectical theology and rhetoric. Similar to his relationship with Roscelin, Abelard challenged William's understanding of the universals and developed a tumultuous rapport with him. William changed his stance on universals after his appraisal of Abelard's contentions. Several of William's students left his tutelage to study with Abelard, which resulted in Abelard being prohibited from teaching throughout Notre Dame. Abelard believed that questions were avenues toward enhancing the faith and gained notoriety for his public debates and his teachings. In his autobiography, The Story of My Misfortunes, Abelard shares that around 1113 CE, after William had been reappointed, he became the private tutor to his niece, Eloise, and details their mentor-mentee relationship that turned into a passionate love affair. This resulted in a son by the name of Petrus Astrolabius, followed by a secret marriage to Eloise and a retreat to the nunnery, whereby Abelard made this adamant request for marriage. In 1117 CE, Eloise's uncle and guardian, Fulbert, believed that Abelard was attempting to dispose of Eloise, and in response, he sent a group of men to castrate Abelard. It was due to this tragic event that for a period, Abelard left his post teaching to become a monk in Saint Denis. Shortly after joining the monastery in 1120, Abelard wrote a treatise called Of the Faith and the Sanctity of the Trinity, which was a direct attack against his former mentor Roscelin's controversial teaching on the persons of the Trinity as three different gods, or tritheism. De Fide became a part of a larger body of Abelard's lectures entitled Theologia Summi Boni, which was a polemic in contention with who he identified as the pseudo-dialecticians, and the hubris that drove their misuse of logic and dialectical approaches. One of Abelard's biographers, John Merkbaum, clarifies that the polemic was certainly aimed at Roscelin. Around the time Abelard authored on the unity and the Trinity of God, which prompted an inquiry into Abelard's theology by the students of his theological antagonists, whom he had criticized often, namely Anselm of Laon and Alberic of Reims. It's interesting when our students become our pit bulls, right? We don't know anything about that. Subsequently, after both treatises were published, Abelard was brought to the council at Soins in 1121, headed by Archbishop of Reims, which of course we know is related to one of his antagonists. The assembly condemned Abelard's teachings and forced him to set fire to his own writings, including his Christian Theology, to evade physical reprimand. Scholars have not found significant evidence that reveals the pertinent theological issues that were deemed heretical. However, Edward Peters notes that it was Abelard's use of logic as a method to explain the theological doctrine that was problematized by his adversaries. Through the condemnation of his work at the Council of Soins, compelled Abelard to move and accept an appointment as abbot of St. Gildas, but eventually moved back to Paris in 1135, where he resumed his writing and public teaching. Over the next decade, Abelard would write a number of different writings to add to his corpus, his commentary on Romans, his Christian Theology, which he memorized prior to burning, ethics, and his Dispatio. In his Dispatio, Abelard was challenged with a back-and-forth conversation with William of St. Thierry. William challenged that he discerned what he discerned to be Abelard's sophomoric spirituality, which led him to pose false theological questions and claims. More specifically, William of St. Thierry took issue with Abelard's doubting in order to inquire method that he introduced in his Sic et Non, as well as the distinctions he made among the persons of the Trinity, in which God the Father was all-powerful, the Son was the incarnation of wisdom, and the procession of the Holy Spirit, without any particular power that does not come from the Father and the Son. William expressed his concern for Abelard's atonement theory, in which the former was more of a strict Augustinian, and the latter conveyed his belief that the incarnation alone, absent the death of Christ, was sufficient for the redemption of humanity. To bring about a formal investigation into Abelard's theological errors, William sent a letter to his close friend, St. Bernard of Clairvaux, pressing him to censure Abelard. St. Bernard met with Abelard to no avail, and called for an assembly that condemned Abelard's teachings at the Council of Sens in 1140, followed by papal decree, Pope Innocent II. The Council of Sens brought both methodological as well as theological issues against Abelard. Methodologically, Anselm of Canterbury sought to reason the faith through doctrinal proofs and an emphasis on the rational contemplation of theology. Peter Abelard challenged the faith through theological questions that explored contradictions within Scripture and patristic writers. In letter 1 to Eloise, he comments, and I quote, "I preferred the weapons of dialectical reasonings to all the teachings of philosophy, and armed with these, I chose the conflicts of disputes instead of the trophies of war," end quote. Arguably, Bernard Clairvaux's accusatory remarks in his letter 190 to Abelard, accusing him of false teaching and eventual formal proceedings against Abelard, can be contributed to Clairvaux's inability to grasp the function of the dialectical method, an ethic of love that he used to reinterpret Anselm's satisfactory theory of atonement. For example, the dialectical method involved the questioning of Orthodox theology posited within Clairvaux's letters, such as the necessity of the death of Christ for salvation, in which Abelard questions, and I quote, "How shall that murder which was committed against Christ be atoned for? Or so many great crimes committed against him or his followers? Did the death of the innocent Son please God the Father so greatly that through it he is reconciled to us? We who perpetuated this by sinning, on account of which the innocent Lord was murdered? Unless this became the greatest sin, could he forgive it much more easily? Unless evils were multiplied, could he do so great a good?" End quote. To catechize the ransom theory of atonement advocated by the patristics, Abelard queries, and I quote, "To whom was the ransom of his blood given that we might be redeemed, unless to him in whose power we were? That is, as was said, God who had delivered us to his torturer? For it is not the torturers, but their lords, who fix or receive ransom for captives. How did he release the captives with this ransom? Is he himself beforehand demanded it or established this ransom so that he might release the captives?" End quote. Commenting on what Abelard presents as a hypothetical scenario in which God is an extortionist to God's self, he states, "How very cruel and unjust it seems that someone should require the blood of an innocent person as a ransom, or that in any way it might please him that an innocent person be slain. still less that God should have so accepted the death of his son, through it he was reconciled to the whole world, end quote. As we hear these words, one might think that you opened up a feminist theology book on ethics or critiquing the ransom theories and substitutionary methods of atonement. But this was the 12th century. Is it a coincidence that Peter Abelard remains unclaimed? While Bernard of Clairvaux observed correctly that Abelard was not a believer in the ransom theory of atonement, Abelard's concern about the use of sin, i.e. the murder of Jesus, in order to absolve sin is not as much a contention with satisfaction atonement as it is an indictment against humanity. Our first observation is that the main issue for Abelard is not whether or not humanity was saved through the death of Christ, but how atonement theories of his time made an omnipotent God subject to the power and authority of another, an immutable God, dishonored and affected by human obedience or disobedience, and an all-loving God, a sadomasochist. Here we find Abelard more of a Neoplatonist than Anselm in the assumption that God's omnipotence, immutability, and constitution as the good, capital G, inclusive of the purest form of love and beauty, cannot be altered as one develops an understanding of the will and activity of God in effectuating salvation through Christ. For Abelard, atonement must be theorized in such a way that it is in alignment with God's nature and the unjust quality of imposed suffering. In The Logic of Love, a critical analysis of the soteriology of Peter Abelard, Richard Weingart notes that Abelard's outline of questions here is a sound bite of sorts. Weingart contends that though this statement does not actually reflect aspects of both ransom and satisfaction theories that Abelard found disquieting, his cross-examination should not be interpreted as a full statement of his soteriology. Weingart points out that there are critical elements to Abelard's soteriology that are not a part of his queries, such as justification, the pardon of sins through repentance, and the ministry of Jesus. Weingart argues that when scholars come to grasp all the component of Abelard's understanding of salvation in relation to his attention to the complete witness of Christ, inclusive of his life and teachings, then Abelard will be rightfully situated within the Augustinian tradition. Alistair McGrath builds on Weingart's argument to describe how Abelard blends atonement theories, and that contrary to modern assessments, his writings demonstrate that he affirmed both the moral exemplar model as well as the satisfaction model. However, humanity is the subject of concern for God, not God's self or the devil. McGrath's point here is substantiated in Abelard's letters to Eloise, in which he adheres to the aspects of the satisfaction atonement absent of concern for God's self or honor or justice. In order to clarify the role of Christ in salvation, Abelard comments on the fulfillment of prophetic utterances of Jeremiah and Zechariah in the Passion of Christ. Abelard spiritually advises in the imperative, and I quote, this is in relation to meditating on the cross. Be remorseful. He too has set up the cross, from which he summons us as a ladder for us to use. On this, for you, the only begotten Son of God was killed. He was made an offering because this was his will, end quote. Abelard, distinct from his contemporary Anselm of Canterbury, makes a sharper indictment in his tone, word choice, and criticism of the crime committed against Jesus. To further castigate this crime and the agony that ensued, Abelard directs Eloise's attention to the misery experienced by Mary, the mother of Jesus, when he narrates the account of the Passion as follows. And I quote, "See, sister, what great mourning there is amongst those who love their king over the death of his only and first begotten son. Behold the lamentation and grief with which the whole household and court are consumed. And when you come to the bride of the only son who is dead, you will find her wailing intolerable and more than you can bear. This mourning, sister, should be yours, and also the wailing, for you were joined to this bridegroom in blessed matrimony. He bought you not with his wealth, but with himself. He bought and redeemed you with his own blood." End quote. This passage is picturesque of Abelard's theology of the cross, and what in part separates his soteriology from that of his contemporaries, namely Anselm of Canterbury. It marks Abelard's discernment of the relational impact that sin has on family and community. The relational consequence is shared pain, anguished, and imposed suffering. Social suffering in this regard is depicted as a contagion of sin. Abelard's attentiveness to the ramifications that sin and evil disaffirm the determination by scholars that he was a subjectivist when it came to his notion of intentionalism versus outcome as the ethical measure in moral theology. Here I'm thinking about Geoffrey House's Abelard on Degrees of Sinfulness, but this medieval back to the future, this medieval way of critiquing what eventually becomes a Kantian philosophy. Marcia Collish argues that Abelard was not a complete ethical subjectivist, but highlights the objectivism present in Abelard's consideration of sin as a moral act against the known will of God that is unbiased by its outcome. Abelard's definition of sin is impartial, and we notice in his words to Eloise his emphasis on the impartiality of sin, how it does not understate the moral imperative to, and I quote, be remorseful, or to take hold of salvation in Christ with deep contrition and recognition of the devastation that sin and evil inflicts on individuals and community. I would like us to consider Abelard's reading of the story of Jephthah and his daughter. It largely goes unexamined by scholars, but it further exemplifies ascertainment of the disparaging outcome of sin within the context of human relations. Medieval scholar Juanita Ferros Ruiz notes Abelard's reproof of the martyrdom of women and his conviction that baptism was a sacrament that equally cleaned both men and women, as highlighted in his homily in Circumcision Domini. As a poetic commentary on Judges 11:30-40, Abelard correlates the bath that Jephthah's daughter takes in preparation to be offered as a ritual sacrifice to the sacrament of baptism, which he believed to be a sufficient oblation to God. Abelard used a condemnatory tone to express his complete disapproval of Jephthah's daughter being offered as a burnt offering, and declaratively asserts that it was not the will of God. I lift this up as many within the womanist corpus might find resemblance in thinking about this experience and this bath and this time that Jephthah's daughter spends with her sisters. In Renita Weems's sister, Just a Sister Away. Abelard indicts Jephthah as a man without wisdom and proper discernment of divine will that makes him the foe of his own daughter when he comments, and I quote, "O senseless mind of a judge, O insane zeal of a prince, O father, but enemy of your kind, which you destroy by the death of your only one," end quote. The importance of this poetic commentary cannot be understated because there are striking parallels between the intrepidness that Abelard attributes to Jephthah's daughter and the way in which he speaks about the courage of Jesus, referring to him as our Joshua. The correlation is this: as Jephthah's daughter is sacrificed to place her father in right relationship with God, and Joshua circumcises a nation to represent their renewed covenant with God, Jesus bravely takes on the physical sacrifice of his life to place humanity in relationship with God. Roger Olson describes this as Abelard's understanding of Jesus winning, and I quote, "merits for us before the Father," end quote. These passages do not only convey Abelard's disdain for human imposed suffering and the relational consequences of sin, but specifically his theology of the cross, as it presents the paradoxical nature of the cross as both a symbol of sin and evil, as well as a symbol of God's prodigal love. We find particular meditation on God's prodigal love demonstrated through this vicarious suffering. The cross signifies the evil that imposes destruction on an individual and community, while at the same time, the cross also signifies the boundless love of God that does not falter in the face of death. I might argue that it is precisely this sentiment that we find undergirding Joanne Marie Terrell's position and thesis in Power in the Blood, particularly her conversation on the importance of seeing the cross, seeing martyrs, seeing those victimized and who take on this suffering at no choice of their own, seeing and honoring their sacrifice as sacramental witness. It signifies the cross in this way: the cross as the symbol of evil and sin, but the cross also signifying the boundless love of God that should be honored when in the face of death of his loved ones. As we can see in Abelard's poetic commentary on Judges 11:30-40, Abelard believed the heroic love of God to be previously demonstrable in women as well as men. More representative of Abelard's love ethic is this often quoted answer to his lengthy outline of questions of ransom and satisfaction atonement theories from his commentary on Romans, in which he states, and I quote, "Nevertheless, it seems to us that in this we are justified in the blood of Christ and reconciled to God, that it was through this matchless grace shown to us that his Son received our nature, and in that nature, teaching us both by word and example, persevered to the death and bound to us to himself even more through love, so that we have been kindled by such a great benefit of divine suffering and grace, true charity might fear to endure nothing for his sake." End quote. For Abelard, the cross is a demonstration of God's immeasurable love for humanity. It pricks the human heart so much so that the humanity is drawn closer to God. Prior to Thomas Aquinas, Abelard puts forth the defining characteristic of love as a theological virtue, as that which emerges from God as an enabling force of reconciliation, demonstrable in its capacity to ignite love and direct humanity back into right relationship with God. Adam Costco notes that it is Abelard's concern for God's relationship with humanity that expresses a relational ontology within his logic of salvation. Abelard's soteriological hermeneutic of love can be understood as his way of emphasizing the continuity of the nature of God revealed in Christ, and how love is a symmetrical element in all that Christ does. This is evidenced in his teachings, ministry, and his suffering, death, and resurrection. Weingart notes that in Abelard's atonement theory, divine love for humanity is the special characteristic of the third person of the Trinity. For Abelard, God's relationship with humanity is consummated in our faithful journey toward embodying love as a theological virtue, as Christ did. If womanists and liberationists were to glean from Abelard and Thomas Aquinas's push and evolution on this element of virtue or the embodiment of virtues, then it is proper to inductively argue that humanity is able to possess the virtue of faith in the acknowledgement of God's existence, as well as in the understanding that a part of God's existence is God's ultimate concern for the well-being of creation. Therefore, through the lens of faith, within the context of oppression, humanity is called to understand that systemic evil is not the intention of God, but the intention and byproduct of the corrupted will of humanity. Distinguishably, what is God's intention in the context of systemic evil is to, and I quote, support resistance and provide sustenance so that we may continue to preserve through hardship or adversity. Therefore, in this regard, survival is not merely continuing to exist, but to institute resistance and opposition to evil into perpetuity. For those who God has infused with the knowledge of God and the understanding of God's righteous intention, survival is an exercise of faith demonstrated by a particular kind of agency. Survival, as a particular kind of agency, is characterized by the resistant presence of the oppressed that continues to provide a threat, physical and otherwise, to systemic evil. The need for the oppressed to provide a contentious presence against systemic evil is predicated on the belief in the possibility of positive change in circumstance. It is also predicated on the pursuant and expectant desire for that possibility to be made manifest. Here, those who survive can interpret their survival as an opportunity to work toward constructing their future to be better than the past. One might consider what survival looks like for those who have crossed on the other side of the Jordan. We understand within the Africana tradition that to survive is to be remembered and endured. So what does this mean for our grandmothers, for our sisters, for our teachers, for those who we have watched, those we have admired, but who were not granted physical survival? We remember them in the survival of their legacies. We remember them by, and remember with a hyphen, member, their person to our hearts and our soul. For we cannot exist without having had their existence alongside us. That the physical chasm, this chasm between the physical and the spiritual, is but an illusion. This remembering is a divine activity in itself. It is why survival can be seen as a theological virtue, for it is God's directing of the human will to an attainable end. Aquinas comments on this attainable end when he states, "For the object of hope is a future good, arduous but possible to obtain. In order, therefore, that we may hope, it is necessary for the object of hope to be proposed to us as possible." End quote. I might argue that this entertainment, this dwelling in possibility and potentiality necessitates remorse. Hearing Peter Abelard's words to Eloise looking upon the cross, be remorseful. For what is remembrance without repentance? But what Nietzsche might say is this eternal recurrence. And I would say eternal recurrence of sin, right? Therefore, survival of the oppressed arguably disrupts the agenda of systemic evil, because the hope that accompanies one's survival is a concern for the future, how one's spiritual ancestors show up in the present and the future, in the embodiment of one's lineage, in the embodiment of this possibility of liberation in that future. What complicates a theology of survival for some, in a social context where resources are competed for and not equitably distributed, is the reality of human preoccupation with one's individual survival, or what is noted by Aquinas as the natural human desire to be assured of one's offspring. An important notation made by Aquinas is his distinction between human passions and the transformation of the human will that results due to God's divine act of spiritually unifying the human will to God's self. We find this prior to Aquinas in Abelard, and Abelard talks about the importance of God's infusion of charity into humanity, thus perfecting the human appetite. This is something to keep us from this perpetual cycle of sin without repentance or remorse. In this regard, the act of survival is intended not only for the benefit of she who survives, but also the benefit of the human community by way of the survival's union with God and subsequent commitment to God's ultimate purpose, which is to renew and perfect all of creation. At this time, I would like to propose and have us think about Dolores Williams's contribution to this understanding of survival as a theological virtue. Survival and quality of life, according to Williams, comes by the power and grace of God, evidenced in the individual and communal exercises of survival intelligences. Together, understanding Williams and Aquinas, survival and quality of life comes by the power of the grace of God. If we're using this language within the tradition, in the individual and communal exercises of the cardinal virtues of prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude. The thing about cardinal virtues, though, Aquinas, is that they can be taught. Theological virtues come from God. Aquinas makes this point clear, however, he does so by starting with abstract concepts of the good. Abelard began with experience as a way of interpreting and interrogating the extent to which these cardinal virtues, or what becomes known as in the intellectual virtues, with Augustine, how they essentially go unfulfilled without faith, hope, and love. Williams understands the experiential element to this questioning, the experiential element of faith, hope, and love that accentuate and allow these cardinal virtues to be fulfilled with the higher reason. Williams' survivalist ethic becomes crucial for understanding the implications of an Abelardian intervention centuries before. It contributes to a moral framework through which she develops a nonviolent perspective that distinguishes itself within Black theological discourse. Williams's God of salvation is not one that is revealed as the God of liberation, as proposed by James Cone, nor is the God of salvation understood to be complicit in the oppression of Black women or completely abstract as proposed in the theistic humanism of William R. Jones. Though Williams likens her work to Carter Hayward's theory and theology of mutual relationality to suggest a point made earlier in the tradition by J.D. Otis Roberts. I'm going through a whole kind of primer here on Black theology. J.D. Otis Roberts, which is that a part of the way that God accomplishes the salvation of humanity is through our survival and the restoration of relationships between God and humanity and between human communities. Williams contended that if Black male theologians appropriated a womanist hermeneutic of identification dash ascertainment, then they would understand the divine gift of salvation to be present in the invitation to participate in the ministerial vision of Christ, rather than human participation in the suffering of Christ. The restoration of human relationships requires understanding how biblical interpretation and theology functions as a theoretical framework that creates and sustains division and estrangement, such as the problem of surrogacy. Very plainly, in a conversation, Williams is reportedly quoted as declaring this, and I quote, "Jesus came for life and to show us something about life and living together and what life was all about. Atonement has to do with death. Jesus conquered sin in the wilderness in life, as opposed to accomplishing human salvation through death." According to Williams, a womanist approach in this regard to thinking about soteriology should be directed to remove surrogacy as a criterion for imaging redemption and to cast down Western traditions, its constructions of divine surrogacy, even its non-mention yet adherence to that we do find in Abelard. Divine surrogacy due to pay Satan for the return of humanity in Origin, or the punishment for sin or the restoration or divine honor in Anselm, are not experientially based. To properly understand salvation and this connection between the tradition and this deviancy that might be understood as virtuosity, a virtuous intervention, is experiential based. It's the way that experiential knowledge as a part of theological method is poking its head out from centuries before and its curtains. For Williams, and one might even say someone like Abelard as a convert, might both agree with this exclamatory statement of the cross and how it can be interpreted as both the execution of innocence and the condemnation of a subversive and redemptive vision by Roman imperialism and patriarchy. I end with this statement by Williams that is such a consummate expression of how this complicated relationship between virtue, love, and suffering come together. Williams notes in Sisters in the Wilderness, the text suggests that the Spirit of God in Jesus came to show humans life, to show redemption through a perfect ministerial vision of righting relations between body, individual, and community, mind of humans and of tradition, and spirit. A female inclusive vision. Jesus' ministry of righting relationship involved raising the dead, those separated from life and community, casting out demons, for example, ridding the mind of destructive forces, prohibiting the flourishing of positive, peaceful life, and proclaiming the word of life that demanded the transformation of tradition so that life could be lived more abundantly. Thank you.
So we heard a lot, did we not? Thick, rich lecture. And since I don't wade in those waters, I took notes and tried to stay afloat. So I'm going to start us off. Unless someone has a burning question, to allow you time to think through everything that you, or some parts of what they heard tonight. So I'm thinking about my question, my first question is really, a question of dialectic, but internal dialectic. What I appreciated and what I gathered from what you said is Abelard, more than deviant, or beyond deviant, he was very cutting edge in his thinking about soteriology. And so I got from your lecture how his theological method could be used not just as a primer, but as a model for womanist and liberationist thinking. However, I'm mindful that this is the Catholic-Orthodox, and this has nothing to do with just Orthodox lecture. And you presented a model of soteriology through Abelard's thinking based in Aquinas or anchored in Aquinas, where soteriology or his soteriology radically upends ransom theory. I am an academic who embraces womanist and other more liberationist thinking, but I'm also a person of faith, and I realize that there are certain aspects of soteriological thinking that, for me, is orthodox. And so I guess the question is, how do you convey to those who are like me this kind of dialectic between the orthodox and the liberationist and the progressive, that Abelard should be taken seriously? Because as you started out and you said to us, Abelard is kind of a castaway. And what you're doing is you're reviving him because you're saying that his thinking has merit for the victimized. So you begin to, and as I sat there, your lecture had me thinking about, yes, ransom theory, but often when we think about ransom theory, we forget love as an ethic or a virtue, or survival as an ethic or a virtue. So for someone like me, how do you convince us that Abelard is worth no longer being a castaway?
I think it comes, and this is how I approach, thank you for your question, Dr. Phillips. Confessionally, I'm a Protestant Christian, Black Christian. It's all about Black Jesus. And so there's a way, and to use the words of Jacqueline Grant, Black womanist Jesus. So there is there is a way that your question is also prompting me to talk personally out of my own conviction, and I think it's about Sike no. I would, if I ever had a tattoo, I don't have any tattoos. If I ever had a tattoo, it would probably be that one, only because it inspires humility.
Okay, tell us what.
Sike no, yes and no.
Yes and no.
Okay. It's essentially that his theological method. Abelard's theological method, and particularly how it's not just as a mode of interrogation, but as a person of faith, it keeps us humble. And so we're having a mixed conversation here. So if I was in a group where I'm only talking to womanists, I would ask us, how might we apply a yes and no, the affirmation and the negation that resides in the same place, to our own interrogation of experience? Okay. The way that we hail experience as a primary resource. Now, the beautiful thing about Abelard that helps us in entering a postmodern kind of structuring of theological method is that it not only is a good use for interrogation, but it also helps us to do the critical work within multiple traditions or multiple perspectives responsibly.
Okay.
And I would ask, who within the tradition helps us do that? That we've been taught. So I think because Abelard's humiliation was so public. So if you can imagine everybody knowing that you have been castrated.
Yeah, that was a big.
Everybody. I mean, it's in the textbook. It's not just in a diary kind of situation. That experience of private and public humiliation, I think, is something that is distinguishable, that makes him distinguished within the tradition, in part because he's directly relatable, because experiences of humiliation are inescapable. They live with us in our veins. They live with us in our memory banks. So I say all of that in terms of, for scholars, for confessional theologians, it helps hold us responsible. For scholars within the academy, it helps us as an integrative tool, interrogative tool, and integrative tool. But it also, because of these significant there are significant parallels. Like, this is a 40-page chapter, so I'm just read like an excerpt. But the parallels among the womanists, not the liberationists, just the liberationists, but it means something different coming from someone who almost died. Like, who literally almost died, and not because, like Aquinas, you ate too much. It's a very different reality, one's proximity to suffering, right? Suffering is inevitable, but in terms of imposed suffering, there's a particular affective dimension to Abelard's guidance and method that he employs. Even in talking to Eloise, it's like he calls her sister. Not just because she's an abbot, she's an abbot. She's over an abbot, an abbess.
But
she shares in this experience with him of meditation. So the other thing is, he was talked about not being spiritual enough, when in fact he's probably more spiritual than all of these abstract medievalists at the time. So I hope that answers.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to, we have access to the question and answer for those who are online. So if you would like to send your question, I will read your question for the audience here as well as online. Do we have any questions from the in-person audience for our speaker? Someone, okay. Can you go?
Hi, my name is Shane Collier, and my question is, so you're dealing with this idea, taking Dolores Williams' womanist text, looking at that surrogacy role and how she talks about, that being unfairly and wrongly imposed on women, especially on black women for so long. And there's this kind of role imposition as well that seems to be given on these traditional soteriologies on Jesus, or atonement theories on Jesus, and that gets juxtaposed against this idea of experience. And I wanted you to maybe tease that out a little bit more. By experience, do you simply mean that it is simply more conscious of the experience of suffering, real life historical events that we know of happened in Jesus, and maybe connects with experiential suffering that we can have? Or is there something else that you mean by this experience versus kind of role dichotomy as I have it in my notes?
Thank you so much for your question. So when I say experience, I am thinking about, and this is Thomistic, but it's Augustinian more so in terms of its rootedness, but it's the pathway toward virtue. And when we're talking about how do we become virtuous on a baseline level, Augustine teaches us that it comes through the moral life within the community. So that involves a particular, when I talk about experience, it involves shaping. So we're not just talking about an experience of suffering, but we're also talking about an experience of having been a part of the infusion of virtue, comes through listening to your elders, comes through self-reflecting on experiences of suffering and joy. It goes back to the question of how do we become prudent? How do we become courageous? How do we become capable of temperance? And it is through and this is where Augustine is particularly, I mean, not Augustine, but Aquinas is particularly helpful, more so than Abelard, and that's building on the importance of developing habits, that the human being itself, to be a human being, to experience humanity, is to experience a reality all within itself, a reality of being shaped by habits that take us closer to God are lined with virtue, habits that take us further away from God or deprive ourselves of the good are closer to vice, to the vice nexus of vices that we can develop. So the experience that, when I'm talking about experience, I'm talking about self-reflective. I'm thinking more within a contemplative aspect. Not just because you experience suffering, you're going to look at the world different. No, there are so many, I mean, we know, and some of us from experience, that some of our suffering we don't think about till 20, 30 years later. But how did that sitting in community, which is the aspect of healing, where healing takes place for a person like Dolores Williams, and this is consistent within the Protestant and Catholic tradition, in part and Orthodoxy, particularly Greek Orthodoxy, that healing takes place in community. That's a particular experience as well. So I hope that helps to unpack like what I mean by experience on the philosophical level, as well as on a more practical kind of.
Other questions? She'll need your mic. Yeah.
So I was particularly intrigued in the deeper dive that you were making towards theological ethics being from God, and the distinction that's being made both from Abelard's experiential ethics, like making some different life choices, play stupid games, get stupid prizes. Like he made some choices, he had some consequences, he developed a set of ethics that were as a result of those. So I was wondering if you could tease that theological virtue section out to the next level for us in thinking through the applications for those who want to continue this dialogue that you're beginning here with womanists or liberationists and others for whom virtue ethics is where we turn. I speak from the camp that, that's, other than applied, those are the only ethics I want to rock with. But I wouldn't know to think about Abelard or even Aquinas as good buddies to do that. So can you talk to me a bit about the process, or either the implications of the next step of that process?
Yes, so thank you for your question, Dr. Moultrie. So one of the starting places, and I credit Dr. Stephen Ray for this, because this is how I was taught, as a theologian who happens to utilize ethics to do theology. So I say that to say I'm not a trained ethicist, I'm a theologian. And so I'm in your lane this evening. But the starting point is often how people are reading Augustine. It's not that, because in Augustine you have almost, some people might fight me on this, 89% of what you find in Aquinas was in Augustine first, just represented. Abelard is also reading Augustine. The other thing is, so the question often is, when it comes to virtue ethics, thinking about the theological virtues, how are we reading Augustine throughout the tradition? And are we being faithful to Augustine in our interpretations? The second thing, because it is in Augustine that we come to understand who's Pauline, he's Ambrosian, so he's pulling, the Pauline tradition is what knocks his whole Manichaeanism out the window. And so a part of meditating on Paul, not Deutero Paul, but particularly Paul's conversation on distinguishing faith, hope, and love as theological virtues. It is the understanding that reason and revelation are never contradictory. So where there is divine revelation in Scripture or other sacred texts that we find, it's the correlation. It always correlates with reason, and I also want to say that we often have to, in this process, had to distinguish. This was constantly in my kind of mojo bag, of a sense, was being careful of distinguishing rationality and reason. They are not the same thing.
What's the difference?
So rationale within this kind of Abelard, Augustinian, and thinking about Abelard and Aquinas, reason comes from God. It's purported and exercised, and we come to it through the use of our natural sensibilities or natural abilities to think, right, and evaluate. And there's a distinction between higher reason and lower reason. But all of it is understood to be endowments that come from God, and those are theological virtues, as opposed to the cardinal virtues that can be taught. The theological virtues are infused, right? So we have to take, as opposed to rationality, where rationality can be reduced in terms of understanding as the capacity to reason. It's often used, and this is where Aquinas is problematic with his hierarchies, to distinguish humanity from other persons and beings in the great chain of being. That we have this capacity for rationality. I think it's also, this is just my, postmodern critique, whatever. How do we know? We make up a lot of assumptions about which creatures can have rationality. Like, I'm just transformed and watching a lot of animated stuff with my nieces and stuff. And so I'm just, all of the elephants talking, monkeys talking, all this kind of But what I'm pointing to is that one of the things I favor with the Abelardian method is that it doesn't allow those assumptions to go unquestioned. So that's some of the things. The way that we're reading Augustine is a good starting point, and thinking about that. And is it faithful to Augustine? And it don't necessarily have to, just for the critical use of theory, it should be faithful to whoever the theorist is, but we don't have to agree with him either. In that this whole process of thinking, and part of the womanist project, and a number of the black liberationists have questioned virtue ethics, right? Because it's predicated on all of these assumptions that's very much associated with the assumptions of the great chain of being, that autonomy, self-sufficiency, immutability, or the ability to be impassible, like all of these things are mimicked after certain projections or ideals of monarchy and sovereignty. So even with the whole virtue ethics issue, I also think being mindful of the ways that we curating our own ethical paradigms that escape and eclipse those very androcentric kind of models, framed within this kind of colonization. Augustine was African, but he was a domesticated North African. So I think so that's the other thing when we're interpreting him. Like, how are we reading his oppression? As we're, it could be anachronistic, but it's the challenges that we make. So I hope that helps in some, okay.
Yes.
So at one point you talked about survival as a theological virtue, and then later on you talked about the traditional theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. And I wondered if you could say more about the relationship you see between survival and those traditional virtues, whether survival is, you're lifting it up as an additional virtue, or whether survival is maybe the fruit of those traditional virtues or the site where those virtues are played out, or some other relationship that I'm not immediately seeing.
So survival, a part of that conversation is thinking about survival not just within the physical realm, but also how our personhood is honored, having lived, like having occupied the breath of God, right? So in terms of faith, faith is understood as that which perfects the intellect. Hope is understood as that which is elevates our will to trust God, right? And love is like this is the culmination of the consummate demonstration of this faith and hope in action, right? But all of these come out of, so just being clear that the theological virtues are there not just for the purpose of our maturation, but to direct us back to God. Though if we understand or posit being unreconciled as the reality. So with that being said, a part of survival and honoring those physically present, the physical life, it's not predicated on time and space, but on that which has inhabited, created out of God, and mobilized through the grace of God. So a part of survival as being argued as a theological virtue is that when we honor, whether it is in memory or in person, the flesh before us, or that it has inhabited divinity, has been a part of divinity, partakes in divinity, that to honor a tradition of faith, hope, and love is to honor, and to truly love God is to love God's creation. So it perfects our intellect in the sense of understanding that honoring or survival as a theological virtue enables us to pull and see God in multiple spaces that we have foreclosed could have existed. So I'm in that argument. One of the things that I'm positing is not that you have a fourth theological virtue in survival, but that honoring survival as a part of theological virtue allows faith, hope, and love to be expressed in a particular kind of way. It's a particular kind of agency, and in itself, it is an expression of love. And culminates the other two, because it's the root of all the passions.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for this lecture. It was fascinating and gives me lots to think about. My question is, in thinking about the relation of Abelard's ethic of love and kind of moral exemplar theory and how you related that to Dolores Williams' understanding of atonement, if I remember correctly, she places both a great emphasis on atonement through the public ministry of Christ, and I can definitely see the relationship between that and Abelard's. She also places a huge emphasis on the resurrection, and I'm wondering what part that plays in all of this. Is that part of like the kind of survivalist element, Christ overcoming death and surviving? How does that play in an ethic of love? Where's the interaction of that coming in, or does it?
Yeah, so thank you so much for your question. So what's so beautiful about the question is that it allows us the opportunity to meditate on Eastern Orthodoxy. which is kind of a missing pot when we're thinking about these relationship between virtue, love, and suffering. And so in regards to the role of the resurrection, one of the prominent themes from the Greek Orthodox tradition is transfiguration. And when we think of transfiguration, it is the process of being, when we think of it from God and God relationship with humanity, not just Jesus' transfiguration. But in a way, Jesus' transfiguration foreshadows our transfiguration. That is ancestral. Because what is experienced in Jesus' transfiguration, who is he talking to? He's talking to his ancestors. He's talking to Moses and Elijah, right? And so, in a very sense, they are resurrected before him. This is why the memory or remembering of those who have contributed to our Constitution, who have contributed to our maturation, to our prudence, to our ability to be courageous, to these cardinal virtues. If we're thinking about the remembering as a part of the transfiguration, then the resurrection is not predicated on death, but transition. Because Elijah doesn't die. Nobody knows where Moses' body is either. I'm going to just say that.
She's speaking, y'all. Who thought about that?
Does that help? Now that's a place that that Dr. Williams wasn't going. Like in part because there are some questions that just don't preach. And she's a black church laywoman. And so what's important to her is the church, the people in the church. Doesn't mean that she, it also is why she doesn't go on diatribes like some other womanists in there setting up their argument. They go through this whole tradition of who's talking about atonement and all this stuff. Her writing, she writes as based on with a lot of assumptions that you know what you need to know already. But also that if you don't know, you can look it up because the information about Europeans are more accessible. So what she does give you and spend more time on, even if we're thinking about resurrection, I would ask her, like just in the whole commentary on Hagar as an Egyptian and the role of Egyptian religion, right? Resurrection features heavily in Egyptian religion. So there is an element there within the Christian tradition when we're thinking about the essence of transfiguration or being infused with moral virtue, being predicated on the presence of our ancestors that doesn't require death. And you also have fruit in Dolores Williams in thinking about the impermanence of death as she begins to talk about how the crucial role or to insinuate that Hagar pulls from her own religious traditions outside of that of her oppressor to figure her way out and to sustain her when death is imminent. Yeah.
I saw everyone taking notes on that one. One last question. Those who are shy, don't be shy. We're amongst friends. All right, I'll ask the last question. So you started out your lecture with, and I hope that you don't have to re-lecture the lecture to answer this question, but I'll let you just answer it. You started out with, spiritual growth can be hindered or cultivated by structural realities. What did you mean when you said that? And how does that relate to what you were talking about tonight?
So in thinking about the complicated this is why suffering is the experience of being impeded is the complication, is what complicates the relationship between virtue, love, and suffering.
Okay.
The reason I say that spiritual growth can be hindered by structural realities, in part, is if we agree with Abelard, if we agree with Aquinas, that this presumption that the capacity to grow in moral virtue is predicated in part by one's capacity to rearrange their life, to take part of this self-governing aspect, that in order to develop the habitus, in order to develop this perpetual habits of, practicing faith, hope, and love, and all these other, virtues that we want to embody, that experience, the extent to which we can experience that eternity that God shares with us with these virtues, is predicated on our power, on the relationship between power, potency, and ability. That we have both the power to do so, which structural inequity is a reality of this inequitable distribution of power.
Right.
Right? That it also places emphasis on the external reality being a part of shaping our interiority.
Okay.
So, for example, if you the one person that came out of a neighborhood where you were dilapidated, the school is underfunded, you sharing textbooks that are decades old, you're told in your home, not just by your parents or your family, but also on television that you turn on for looking for affirmation in a lot of ways. If you're told that you are not malarkey, but you're the only one in this whole space that chooses to believe it, like to not believe it, but to believe what God tells you that you are.
Right.
Fearfully and wonderfully made, all this wonderful stuff, right? So to embrace that despite one's structural reality is very hard. That's essentially what I'm saying.
That's what you're saying. Okay.
It's not impossible, but it does impede structural realities do impede it, does hinder, it does project onto us disadvantages, obstacles in the way of grasping our participation and existence in the divine.
And that leads me to towards the end when you talked about remembering, but not just remembering, but remembering. So essentially what you're saying is it is a challenge for us to remember our own selves too.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I understand. Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for coming tonight. I will give it over to Alice to say some closing words, or I will actually say some closing words, and then Alice will say some closing words. We appreciate you coming tonight. This is something very new, this partnership that we hope will manifest in other ways, in different ways, moving forward. The importance of the partnership from the perspective of Black Church Studies, which has been in operation, the certificate program, the curricular program at Candler for 33 years, is that there is a particular way of thinking about the Black church and Black church tradition that sometimes is very narrow. And under my tenure as director, which will not last a lifetime, under my tenure, my desire is to widen the borders of what we understand as Black church tradition. And in many respects, we often ignore the richness of the Catholic tradition and the Black church tradition within the Catholic faith, which, if we understand civil rights history and other history in America, Black Catholics were very much involved in the civil rights movements, both fathers and sisters were involved, as well as lay people. So I think that we are at a historic moment in our lives where we can accommodate what it means to be Black church and broaden the borders of understanding Black church tradition, inclusive of the Protestant faith as well as beyond the Protestant faith. So it was my pleasure that Alice approached me and asked if the Black Church Studies program at Candler would be willing to co-partner. And of course I said yes, because Dr. Watkins is my friend and a brilliant young scholar, as we heard tonight. So once again, I thank you for coming out, and I ask Alice to close us out.
Yes, well, thank you, Dr. Phillips. And I just want to say, too, this partnership collaboration for tonight's Catholic-Orthodox lecture has meant so much to the Aquinas Center as well. We recognize that the church is diverse and that we need to reflect and highlight that diversity in the church, and particularly being in the city of Atlanta and the diverse landscape that's here, it's just critical that we do that moving forward. And I hope tonight is the beginning of many more collaborations to come. It's been a joy. So thank you so much. And also a heartfelt expression of gratitude to the Reverend Dr. Michele Watkins for being here tonight. Your lecture was so robust and thought-provoking, and I know it will be seen for years to come on our YouTube channel. So thank you so much. Just a few brief announcements before we go tonight. There is a QR code over there, and for those of you on the webinar, you'll be getting it. You'll be getting it in an email. Please take the time to fill it out. It's really important that our events reflect what our audience wants to hear, and also that they're quality events, so that we can. Your feedback is critical to making sure that both those points are made through our events. And then the second thing I wanted to mention is to extend an invitation to you all to join our Major Catholic Speaker Lecture, which will occur on October the 19th. And we're going to be celebrating the life and art of John August Swanson. These events will be in partnership with Candler School of Theology and Commonweal Magazine. So please come and join us. It will be upstairs in the atrium for the dessert reception, and in Cannon Chapel for the lecture. The lecture will begin at 7 p.m. So please come join us. Thank you all for coming tonight, and thanks again for joining us this evening. We hope you enjoyed it. Good night.